Welcome to Humanity in Deep Space, Episode 21, Governance and Conflict in Space. As our transition to a spacefaring species accelerates, primary attention is often centered around technological, human health, and commercial issues. But another key and likely existential problem involves the hard challenges surrounding governance and conflict in space. Given the history of global relations and the reality of human nature, can our planet actually develop a sustainable, ethical, and enforceable space interplanetary plan and agreement? Our guests today include Michelle Hanlon, Executive Director, Master of Laws Program, Center for Air and Space Law at the University of Mississippi School of Law. Dr. Gregory Miller, Dean of Space Education, United States Space Force. Scott Tate, Captain, U.S. Navy, retired, Executive Director of the National Security Innovation Catalyst at UC San Diego. And Joseph Young, Director of the Patterson School of Diplomacy and International Commerce at the University of Kentucky. Our host and moderator is Chris Kimmel, founder of Humanity in Deep Space and co-founder of the commercial space company Space Tango.
Hello, this is Chris Kimmel with Humanity in Deep Space. I want to welcome all of our viewers today to this webcast. We're really excited about today. We've got a really interesting, fascinating topic and four great, very knowledgeable, experienced panelists. Humanity in Deep Space is really kind of a think tank to create a conversation globally around a lot of the issues, complicated issues and hard problems facing humans, facing our species as we continue to be a spacefaring civilization, which we already are. Not only science and technology issues, but the interface between technology and humans and human health and medicine, psychology, isolation, ethics, law, what are we going to eat in deep space missions? All of those things kind of coming together for us to understand how we can hopefully successfully do this. Let me start out by thanking our sponsors of this event, but also of Humanity in Deep Space, Space 629, Kentucky Science Technology Corporation, Space for Food, the National Stem Cell Foundation, Kentucky Humanities, Media Collaboratory, Baird Financial, Higher Orbits, Visit Lex, the Interstellar Foundation, 22 Solutions, and Space Tango. So let me start out by asking each of you to just briefly introduce yourself. We'll start with Scott.
Thanks, Chris. Scott Tate from San Diego, former Navy officer. Did a lot of policy and innovation stuff there, now with UC San Diego and a number of startups here in Southern California that all have kind of space-centric efforts.
Thanks. Michelle?
Sorry, my hand was off the button. Michelle Hanlon, I'm a space lawyer. I'm the executive director of the Center for Air and Space Law here at Ole Miss. I'm also the co-founder of an NGO called For All Moonkind, which is focused on protecting human heritage in outer space. And we are a permanent observer to the United Nations Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space, which gives us a really interesting sort of view of what's going on internationally with respect to space activities. Thank you.
Thank you. Greg?
Yeah, hi, Greg Miller. I am the Dean of Space Education for the U.S. Space Force. I help run our professional military education program for Guardians and other service here in Washington, D.C. at the Johns Hopkins University SAIS building. I'm a political scientist by training, spent the first 18 years of my career focusing on terrorism, but needed something a little more uplifting, pun intended, and I've spent the last 5-6 years focused on space and am teaching a lot of space content to our Guardians and other service members.
Thank you. Joe?
Thanks. My name is Joe Young. I'm the director of the Patterson School of Diplomacy and International Commerce at the University of Kentucky. I met Chris here in Lexington and was excited to hear all about the things that are happening related to space. I'm an expert really in war and conflict and terrorism, and I've worked with the Department of Defense, Department of State, USAID, lots of other government agencies on these sorts of issues of governance and conflict.
Thank you. Well, it's obviously become very clear among all of the other things in space that just all the hard problems that we face, one of the hardest deals with governance and conflict, and it's becoming more and more a topic of conversation as more and more countries enter the space arena, and more things are happening. Um, Looking at, we're going to deal with both these topics, but kind of maybe looking a little bit more at starting at the governance side. Um, I mentioned earlier before we got on with the speakers that a lot of times I'll start off with a question or two, but with this, I think given the really complex, complicated nature of all this, I'm just going to throw out back to the panel and just ask the question of when we're talking about this, kind of, where should we start?
So I'm the lawyer, so I'll start with I'm not I'm the pushy lawyer, let me say,
Sorry.
many other kinds. I'm going to start with the Outer Space Treaty. So in many ways, this is a very complex area. In many ways, it's very simple from a legal standpoint because we have a two-page document with 17 articles that govern all of space activities. So this is the Magna Carta of space law. It's not like a code of conduct. It's not traffic lights, stop here on red. It's oh, hey, space is for everyone. Space, the exploration use of space are the province of all humankind. And we have those two basic concepts are the fundamental precepts of space, which of course means there's going to be conflict. And thankfully, the Outer Space Treaty was primarily negotiated as a disarmament treaty so that we have Article 4, which prevents the placement. No, I was a M&A attorney for 20 years before I transitioned into space law. So I'm a contracts lawyer. I love words. I love the words they use in the Outer Space Treaty. It doesn't prohibit the placement. It says you shall undertake not to place nuclear weapons or weapons of mass destruction anywhere in space. And so there's does that give us wiggle room or not? I just think it's an interesting use of the language. But that, so that really, when we talk about where we start with governance, that's where we start. We don't, international law applies to space. We have this provision that doesn't cover conventional weapons. And then everything else is freedom of exploration and use. And that is just a surefire way to promote conflict.
Okay. Other thoughts here?
Yeah, Chris, I would jump in and
Yeah.
say, humans haven't changed at all. That ought to be
Right.
our foundational lens as we go into this. And so looking back, we can learn a lot about what it might look like going forward. And there's this constant human trend of we see new technologies, and so we assume that the world is somehow different because of them. And then we follow this repeating pattern of law and policy and norms and all that other stuff only following behind tragedy. So we always get out ahead of ourselves. We wind up in a conflict or we have some other big tragedy, and then we go, oh, well, we should have prevented that. But it's the same stuff that we've done again and again and again. And it would be really nice if this time going into space where we have sort of a way to slip the surly bonds of national demarcations and whatnot here on Earth, we could do it a different way. I'm not necessarily hopeful, but it would be nice. And I think it is an
Yes.
opportunity.
Greg?
Yeah, I mean, so let me start off by the usual disclaimer. As a federal employee, I'm here in my own capacity, not representing the Space Force or Johns Hopkins University. I taught a course last year on space governance, a whole semester. We talked about the Outer Space Treaty. We talked about the 5 UN treaties that try to govern space to some greater or lesser extent. But at the end of the day, and this kind of gets us into our other category, you have just within the last 5 years, the United States in particular, talking about space as a warfighting domain. You now have other countries. I think Germany just came out and said that they agree that it's a warfighting domain. And so you have this fundamental, like Scott was saying, fundamental human nature is not just to think that we're going to be different with new technology, but the sort of Machiavellian realist in me says where there's humans, there's going to be conflict, but we don't even need humans in space to potentially have conflict. And so I think governance is really critical, but like all of international relations, it falls on the states to govern. And I think that some of our current governance treaties, and maybe Michelle and I differ a little bit on this, I'm not sure they do enough to address non-state actors, the commercial actors that are becoming so prevalent in space and don't necessarily have to adhere to some of the same rules that states do. I just think that this is sort of an interesting area, not to necessarily treat governance and conflict as two separate things, but where do the two overlap? And how do you get these different actors involved in one or the other?
Joe, anytime you guys wanted to say something too, just raise your hand. I'll
Yeah,
jump
I
in.
mean, it's good to follow everybody because everybody was saying such interesting things. But Greg and I come from a pretty similar tradition, and one of the things that I think all of us who study war on Earth acknowledge is that our system's characterized by anarchy, right? Not necessarily that anarchy doesn't necessarily mean that there's lawlessness, but that there's no higher authority that can step in and stop these things. And there's no 911 in the international system, right? It's a state self-help support system, and that so it is on Earth, so it shall be in space. And because of that structural situation, we don't even have to think about bad actors. It's just because you have this situation where people are trying to increase their own security, and those moves to increase your security can be viewed as by other states as offensive when they really were defensive. That misperception can spiral into war, and so that's a real big concern. And I think that concern gets amplified in space because so much of the technology is dual use, where up to 95% of the things in space can be used for good or for war. And so those, it may be that the structure of the system just makes it more challenging for war. That's the bad news, right? That's the stuff that the people who study war, like Greg and me, will say. But then I think on the other side of it, there is, as Michelle was saying, there's a good bit of law that is governing some more reasonable interactions. And just like the people who are sort of negative about international law on Earth, they have to contend with the fact that most international law is followed most of the time. And why can't that be the way it is in space? And why can't we come up with arrangements to govern behaviors that will kind of persist and be more peaceful? And especially, I mean, it's the same anarchic situation here and there, and we've figured out ways sometimes to subvert it.
Okay. Any other thoughts on this? Again, just chime in anytime you want. Well, I was going to go back to Michelle and ask her, Michelle, so how much credence do you? Because when I talk to people in the industry, and I know they always, a lot of them take me back to the space, Outer Space Treaty in 1967. How much credence do you put in that in the 21st century?
100%, 150%, 200%. This is a treaty that has been ratified since 1967, created obligations. It is ratified by China and the United States and Russia and India. And the beauty of the Outer Space Treaty, and also its failing, which Greg sort of pointed out, is okay, it's got these wonderful aspirational principles that are not that hard to follow, but they are open for incredible interpretation. So as lawyers like to say, it's really easy to get people to agree on an idea, on the words, but you will never get them to agree on the interpretation of those words. And so
Right.
the Outer Space Treaty is a beautiful document because it has a framework, but you can shoot holes through every single article. And so to directly address what Greg said about non-state actors, we do have a provision in the Outer Space Treaty, Article 6, which says that states are obligated, are responsible for the national activities of even their non-governmental entities. So that sounds like, okay, the state is, if Elon Musk or Jeff Bezos blows up something in space by accident, then the United States is liable. But lawyers also look at the language with particularity. It says the national activities of non-governmental entities. What is a national activity? Huge question for interpretation. And then it goes on to say that commercial parties, non-state actors, have to act in conformity with the Outer Space Treaty. Again, that's a funny word, conformity. It's not they have to comply with, it's they have to be in conformity with. And what does that mean? Is it different? I don't know, but the negotiators certainly chose that word. And then finally, you have to authorize and supervise the activities of all your nationals. So it's a much broader obligation requirement. But again, what does that mean? If you, and the United States has interpreted that to mean we're going to put a lot of regulations on our licensees, on our space actors, and that's why we have the most robust regulatory regime for space activities than any country in the world. And we put the most restrictions to again, as an example, we have an international non-binding voluntary agreement to that anything that you send up to space, you must assure that it returns into and is broken up in the atmosphere within 25 years of the end of its life. So you send anything up you want, but you have to get it out of orbit within 25 years. The United States has unilaterally imposed on its licensees now a 5-year. So reduce that 25 to a 5-year requirement that you have to pull that out of space. So yeah, I mean, I think the treaty is a beautiful thing, but it's our generation's responsibility now to start filling some of those holes in a responsible way.
Um, yeah, by the way, anybody watching that would like to pose a question, you can do that on the curated chat. And so please feel free to ask a question at any point. We'll try to get to as many of those as we can. So to go back to something Scott alluded to, and kind of playing the devil's advocate a little bit. And again, there's no right answers here, so we're not looking for the solution. We know that these are complicated things that will have to find their own path. But going back to that and looking at human nature, and when we also have treaties that say you can't invade other countries, and we do it all the time. And so how do we and I do agree with, I think Greg brought an interesting point up that, most of the time these laws are abided by, these norms. And I think that's and a friend of mine, Ken Newman, who used to be a lead attorney at NASA, brought to my attention the nuclear test ban treaty is something that has, for the most part been adhered to. But again, going back to the human nature, I mean, it's great to talk about all this, but are we really, as we as species, are we really up to this? Forget all the other things. I mean, if you look at historically, I don't see a whole lot of examples where we've done a very good job following these kinds of norms.
So I do think that there are examples where even international law is abided by. I mean, you can look at like the Arctic and Antarctic. You could look at UNCLOS for some extent. I don't think anybody would disagree with a lot of what Michelle said. I think the challenge is kind of what Joe was talking about is how do you enforce these rules?
Right.
When it's up to the states to do the enforcing themselves. You almost have to create situations where it's in the state's interest to follow the rules, and therefore they will do it and sort of self-regulate, like Michelle was talking about. The United States does heavily, but we don't necessarily have the capabilities to enforce those rules on other countries. Or even if we have the capability, do we have the will to do so? We've established through a long series of interaction, Arctic cooperation through the Arctic Council and laws. That's something that we can maybe take to space and apply, but it still comes down to the states having to enforce those laws if somebody chooses not to abide by them. That to me is the biggest challenge.
Yeah, just to build on that, this is the challenge in any sort of state-based structure in trying to deal with people's derivations or the things that they do wrong vis-a-vis other states. But we have examples of that too with the WTO, right? If if a particular trade isn't done in the way it's supposed to, the WTO will authorize states to counter each other's behavior. We also, I mean, and Michelle probably knows a lot more about this case than I do, but there was the case of Canada suing the former Soviet Union for the space junk that fell in their country, and they were compensated for it. So I think we do have some examples where this can be done in a more decentralized fashion that doesn't require a global hegemon, but it will require lots more time and interaction, and it's going to be state-based.
Yeah, I agree
Scott,
with all that. I think it's also interesting when you look at it. Good law generally grows out of a consensus around what is best for the most of the people most of the time. And because we don't have a lot of experience in space, it's sort of hard to see where those incentives are. And I think a lot of people don't necessarily grasp how different space is. If two ships hit each other on the ocean, the damage is confined to a really small area. If two big things in space hit each other, it could take out a quarter of the orbits that are available. So we tend to apply the logic that we're familiar with here on Earth and not understand how there are differences in technologies and areas, and maybe we ought to be a little more careful and a little more restrictive. I love that the test ban was mentioned. The test ban came about mostly because the Russians set off a weapon that was so large that it cracked the Earth's mantle. And when they did follow-on testing, realized what type of earthquakes could have been generated if that had been done somewhere else. And everybody said, whoa, maybe it really is in everybody's incentive not to play with these things the way we've been playing with them anymore. So, looking where the incentive structures are and trying to make the law follow those incentives to at least get some of the easy things off the table might be a start.
Something in this vein, not directly, but about a year and a half ago, as you probably remember, a company was, more and more private companies are now launching things to the moon, was launching a payload to the moon. And I think I can't remember specifically, but it may have included some extremophiles or, some primitive life form or something that they were doing. And there was an indigenous tribe in the United States that objected, vociferously about that, saying, the moon is sacred to us, and we have some real issues here. I'm not getting into that so much, I can't remember, but it was interesting. As I recall, and I may be getting this a little bit wrong, but I think it's right. One of the responses from NASA, or some of the people at NASA, was, well, that's a private company, because they had appealed to NASA. We really don't have, there's not much we can do or say about that. And I thought to myself, if that's the rule, we're all in big trouble.
I just need to.
So is that the rule?
I just need to jump in because it was human remains that the Navajo objected to. And this was a really particularly interesting case because there are human remains on the moon already.
Right.
Eugene Shoemaker's remains are on the moon. And that decision to send those remains to the moon was made spontaneously by NASA engineers. There was no vetting, no State Department question, no, does this violate the Outer Space Treaty? Everyone just sat in a room and was like, oh my God, what? We should do this. And everyone's like, yeah, that's a great idea. And so those were sent to the moon. And then when a celebratory statement was issued by NASA, Navajo said, wait a minute. And NASA promised, the US government promised Navajo Nation that if they ever did this again, they didn't say they wouldn't do it again, but they did say, we will consult with you, right? And so that is when Navajo objected. They said, you promised you would consult with us and you didn't. And NASA said, oh, no, it wasn't us. It was this private company. So, this is again,
right.
Talking about this is one of my biggest concerns, other than conflict in space, because this also will produce conflict because people are sending stuff to the moon just because they can, right? And I understand that for some startups, this is a way to earn money. But we have rich people sending stuff to the moon, and other people. It was a company called Celestis, and I said, don't you feel a little bit elitist? And they said, well, it's only $8,000. I'm like, okay, only $8,000. Like, what? How do you have that mentality? And so, when we think about where the conflict will come, how it will come, and this concern about commercial entities and private stuff going to the moon. Firefly landed, and their Blue Ghost lander, when it signed off, said, we are going to be here forever watching humanity progress. And I'm like, well, then you're occupying it, right? Does that mean you don't think anybody can move your spacecraft? These are the questions we have to determine, like who is making these decisions about what you can send and what you can't send. We're sending so much art to the moon now. I'm like, I can draw something and send it to the moon. Will it be art? I don't know who makes the
So again, I'll let you know. This is a really good, interesting conversation. But so who governs this? Can I create a space company and within reason, I'm not seeking weapons, but just say I'm like on my own. And what if I, what if I say, okay, I want to send something up there, and I'm gonna have a communication device, and people are gonna pay to communicate with that. So it's basically a capital investment, a commercial thing. Is there anything now, or is there anything being contemplated? That says, wait a minute, there has to be somebody looking at this stuff. Or it can't be just open season, because if it's open season on the moon, it's going to be open season on Mars too.
I mean, I'm curious to see what other thoughts are. My views are right now it's open season. The only thing that you have to do is you can't put the celestial bodies must be used exclusively for peaceful purposes, but otherwise it's freedom of exploration and use, so long as you show due regard for the corresponding interests of others. And so I want to go back to then Greg's point of how do we interpret that then? So we know the United States, China can't go to the moon and start selling machine guns or whatever weaponry would work in space. But can a private company do that?
Yeah. And how do we know? I mean, again, not to be, I mean, argumentative, but how do we know that a private company doesn't say, "Oh yeah, we're sending up roses," but they have a weapon inside the spacecraft? I mean, is there someone? And maybe I'm wrong. Is there? I mean, I know with Space Tango, for example. I mean, everything we send up is vetted, and there's inspections, and we can't send anything up that has any kind of danger to it, or et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So there's really strict protocols. Uh, but if I'm a private company and I put something up there, and does anybody actually look at my payload?
I think what you're getting at, and if I could kind of take it in a different direction, but
Yeah.
maybe answer that question and also go back to something Scott said about, if two ships crash on the ocean. I think part of the problem with space is that things that happen in space are less visible to the general
Right.
public, right? If a ship blocks the Suez Canal, you've got cameras on it, people know what's going on. It may not have a global effect right away, but we kind of know it's happening. Whereas in space, I mean, I often say, people don't realize how dependent we are on space, especially in the United States, and they way overestimate how much taxpayer money we spend on space. And so there's this assumption that we're not really getting anything out of space, and we don't really know what's going on there, both in terms of like space traffic management, but also just visibility of activities. And it's not something that the public generally pays as much attention to as things that happen in the terrestrial sphere, where we can, get 24/7 news coverage of something that happens, even if it doesn't have a global effect.
Yeah,
Scott?
agreed. So I think there's a wonderful parallel to look at here, and it's the age of Western European exploration from the 1300s on, but particularly after 1600, when the large private capital corporations first emerged. So the Dutch East India Company in, I think it was 1602, and the British East India Company in 1600. And there's this same sort of evolution from it being relatively small one-off efforts to go out and trade and explore to a really large concentration of capital. And I think we're sort of entering that phase now. And when you saw that concentration of capital, there were also the emergence of all of these other things like private security. Privateers and private company security and all that predated modern navies and things that were more regulated at a national level. And it led to a lot of problems. Going back to my first comment, most of the laws and treaties and things that govern that eventually grew out of tragedies and accidents that weren't anticipated, but were kind of the result of this stimulus and counter stimulus and response between private interests. And yeah, so if we don't learn from that history and intervene, and right now there's no evidence that we're going to, there's not a lot of incentive for governments to get involved and be seen as hindering exploration up there right now.
Right.
We should expect that we're going to see the same sort of pattern emerge.
Going back to something Scott alluded to earlier about, the book Sapiens, which I had read his second book, not his first, but when Scott recommended it, I went back and read that, and it was great. One of the things that's, he mentions in there is, and it's, humans are the ultimate invasive species. Again, what we're talking about, I think is, how do we is there some, not to be naive, how do we kind of cope with that? I can tell you in the space sector, in the space industry, people talk about this a lot, and there's a lot of really Pollyannish thinking that goes on. A lot of times when these questions are raised, people will say, well, it's going to be hard, but I'm confident humans will figure this out in some way. And I think sometimes they've watched too much Star Trek and think it's going to reach the Federation of Planets, which, maybe we will sometime. But, it seems to me that the fact that since we are now a spacefaring civilization, it's not the future. We have had people living and working in space for decades. We've been in space since the 60s. We have people on the moon, and I always tell people when people ask me when I'm giving a talk, "What do you think will be on Mars?" My answer is we're already there, because robots and humans are always going to be intermingled and on space, and so this isn't the future. So how do we proceed from here and not push this down the street until it's too late, if it's possible?
So can I would like to ask a question of our terrorism experts, and because and thinking of the East India companies, a lot of times when people talk about conflict on Earth, it's about resources. It's about resources, right? And so, I tongue in cheek often say, look, if we can survive the next 100 years as a species, then we'll be fine because it'll take us about 100 years to figure out how to access all the tremendous infinite resources of space. But when you see some of the conflicts that we're looking at on Earth, they seem to be more about religion than resources. Is that naive? Is that right or wrong? I mean, are we going to be able to once, let's fast forward 100 years when you can pop over and get your own titanium for whatever. Are we going to have conflict anyway?
Yeah, I'll take the first cut at that. I mean, I would say most of the conflicts around the world have little to do with religion or ideology. I mean, they're sort of epiphenomenal. There's differences, but what's the big issue in Israel Palestine is land, water. These are not. We have plenty of people of different religions living peacefully in other parts of the world with similar sorts of challenges. I think we are. And this is maybe getting back to what Scott's saying. I think we are very territorial animals, and resources are important, and we fight over these sorts of territories and access to resources and our ability to grow our group. And I think it has less to do with those sorts of other activities like ethnicity and religion. But Greg, you're okay to disagree with me.
No, I completely agree. I mean, this is the way I've been thinking about it for decades, is religion, ideology, ethnicity. These are absolutely tools of recruitment and fundraising and ways of identifying an adversary that you can target. And if your goal is to please God, it makes it easy for you to not compromise with the enemy. But at the end of the day, most of these conflicts are about something very tangible and material, whether it's territory or water or power. And so I think we will still have those conflicts in the future wherever you have humans. It may be justified in terms of an ideology or a religion, but it will be about controlling the liquid water on a celestial body or a Lagrange point or whatever it might be. There will be some strategic cause that leads to conflict rather than the sort of beliefs that are often used just as a means of recruiting or identifying an enemy.
So go ahead. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, I don't disagree with any of that. I think the first conflicts in space will probably be in or near low Earth orbit, and it will be based on people putting capabilities in orbit that can have direct impact on the Earth. And that's going to be another one of these tit for tat necessities, right? Once somebody has something up there that might be able to do that, you must put counters up. If you listen to Space Force's messaging today, they talk about space being the ultimate high ground, and they're clearly insinuating that it's the high ground for warfare on Earth. So I think we will eventually get in the future as things like Lagrange points become more important because there's more capabilities that we want to put out there. But in the near term, it's going to be low Earth orbit or Earth impacting orbits and things that can be put up there and must be countered. And then you wind up with kind of the ultimate dual use conflict, right? If everything we put up, we're making dual use because we think it makes it harder to attack, and it's economically more feasible. But
so let me change just a little bit and leap forward. So Scott, what we've all been talking about, and I remember, Scott, you and I having conversations before on the phone about higher ground and things, and I've been surprised at how many things within the past 6 months I've seen on the social media and LinkedIn about space warfare. Here's how you survive space. Here's how you conduct space warfare. I've seen probably 3 posts on LinkedIn in the past week on this. So I want to go back and something, Scott, you alluded to about the ultimate high ground. In my gut, it tells me that space warfare, I mean, all warfare can be like this, but because it's the ultimate high ground, is really an existential threat to humanity. Am I wrong?
I don't think so. I think every time we say that, we prove ourselves wrong pretty quickly. It's another expansion of warfare. It would be disruptive economically and in a lot of other ways if we had a big conflict up there. But I don't see it as an immediate existential threat unless we put immediate delivery nuclear weapons that can deliver from orbit in a matter of seconds or minutes, rather than the more predictable ballistic missiles that we tend to have right now for strategic deterrence. Something like that could be so strategically destabilizing that it results in a broader conflict on the Earth that becomes an existential threat.
We do need to kind of be careful how we talk about space, because there's often an incentive to just kind of lump space together. I do think there are a lot of differences between sort of the Earth orbits versus cislunar space versus lunar surface and beyond. And if something were to happen to completely take out GPS, for example, that wouldn't necessarily be an existential threat, but it would make the COVID pandemic seem like a walk in the park in terms of being able to get, supplies and things like that. And I don't know that most people realize how dependent we are on those kinds of things. Whereas, a conflict that's farther out that happens on the lunar surface might not have even a remote effect on humanity. And so I think it is important to kind of parse out the different geographies of space and how relevant they are to these kinds of conversations.
Joe, you were going to say something?
Yeah, I was just going to build on something that Scott said, which, again, I don't necessarily think space war is existential potentially, but I think one of the dangers of it is and Scott was sort of alluding to it, is that there is a real incentive to be the first mover. So it gives offense kind of an advantage, which increases the likelihood that you see intense conflict.
Yeah. So what I hear, Gregor, so we're looking at maybe the most immediate threat is non-kinetic type things in low and intermediate orbit. Is that the biggest, maybe one of the biggest? Because we're already seeing, I don't know the specifics, but I believe that China has got a number of anti-satellite weapons that they've put in orbit or thinking about it. And those are, again, the non-kinetic nature of some of this stuff. I don't know how they function. So is that something that's maybe something on our doorstep?
Yeah, I think that, not to get into classified content or anything, I think there's enough out there in the open source that we can talk about some capabilities of adversaries. But the bottom line is there are still only a handful of actors that can actually put something kinetic up in space that would threaten our assets. The bigger threat, the lower bar, are things like cyber attacks, electronic warfare, hacking into uplinks, downlinks, ground control stations. Things like that are much more likely to affect our space interests than sort of the short-term futuristic lobbing an ASAT at a satellite or a satellite grabbing a satellite and throwing it in space. Some states have that capability, but by and large, a lot of the actors that we're concerned about in the terrestrial sphere, non-state actors, bad actors, those kinds of things, it's much more likely to be electronic warfare, cyber, something along those lines. And we've already seen some of that happen.
Yeah, let's turn to some of the questions, and you guys, you can see them too. If there's one particular question you'd like to respond to, I'm gonna. So I've got a colleague, Tiffany Vora, so I'm gonna go for her first, just because I know her. She's a good person. What about acute, urgent situations where bad action is fast, but litigation, legislation, enforcement are substantially slower? If particularly if multilateral action is needed.
I don't think that's a what about. I think that's an inevitable. That's exactly the
Okay.
way it works on the Earth usually as well.
And you think it'll work similarly with space?
Yeah, I mean, I think Article 3 of the Outer Space Treaty does say international law applies to space. There's not a special court for space activities. So you would do what you would do on Earth. You'd go to the UN Security Council or, the Security Council of the United Nations. And I think one thing, and I want to say I was both sort of uplifted by your comments and then, really downtrodden, I guess, whatever the opposite is, because um, I think, yes, human nature, I always thought, well, if we get behind, maybe we won't be fighting about the Lagrange points. We'll be more like the Polynesians, right? Well, we don't need to fight over this island because I'll just get on my boat and find another island, right?
Right.
And so that's my sort of rose-tinted vision of space. But so when I think about dealing with these conflicts, we do have a United Nations Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space, and it has met every year since 1958, with the Soviet Union since 1961, I think. So this is a body within the United Nations that meets, and nobody ever skips it. And maybe they don't get a lot of stuff done quickly. Took 17 years to get non-binding remote sensing principles. But you know what? Everybody shows up and everybody talks. I do think that from my vantage point in being an observer there is a sense that outer space is different. Like it is really going to be very easy for us to screw this up. And so everybody understands it. And I think the Chinese reaction or non-reaction to the Russian ASAT test in November 2021 is a case in point. I think Putin was reined in by China. Don't do that again because you're going to blow it for all of us. And so I do think, Tiffany, that there is a path for urgent situations. It's going to be the same kind of path that we followed with respect to the invasion of Ukraine, but there is a path there.
So do we have are we going to have maybe we already do. Are we going to have like a space court? Do we need a space court?
I hope so. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, literally, even now, so where everybody begins to get up to speed and educated and talks and says, hey, okay, this is going to the space court, because these things go all different, right now they can go all different places, but it seems to me that what we're talking about, it might be useful to create a body, that at least is a deliberative body if they can't enforce everything.
And this is where private companies can help, right? Because if you all agree to a certain court, there are a lot of movements to create something like a bankruptcy court, right? A space court. So at least you have the same judges. Sorry, Greg, I interrupted.
Oh, no, I was just going to say that I think this is a great example where different aspects of space come into play, because if it's something that happens in orbit, then it probably is relatively easily dealt with through the court systems that exist either in the domestic sphere or internationally. If it's something that happens, on the lunar surface where you have a lot more autonomy, I mean, going back to Scott's point about the age of sail, you're almost putting some authority in the hands of whoever is governing that base or that station or that ship. And it becomes like the captain of a ship where they have a lot of authority to deal with things that happen as they come up, because you don't have the ability to go back and forth quickly through communications.
Interesting. So, Scott, how much authority did you have? That's an interesting point. How much authority did you have as a commander on a destroyer?
They lovingly refer to Naval Ship Command as the last absolute monarchy.
Okay.
Tremendous responsibility.
Yeah. Because I think that's a good analogy that Greg just brought up. I hadn't thought about that.
And when Navy guys look at this, when we talk about it in our maritime class, we kind of jokingly say that the Air Force and Space Force are really like the Space Coast Guard, right? They kind of hang out close to shore and they do their thing within a couple thousand miles of Earth most of the time. If you want to talk about maritime analogies, when you get to the moon and beyond, that's a lot more like a traditional naval sort of application where you're gone for months or years and you got to kind of figure everything out on your own and you don't
Right.
have ready access to maintenance and other things.
Any other questions you guys, any that you see that you'd like to respond to?
Yeah, I would think that I was going to jump in
Yeah,
on
sure.
Julia's question at 249, where she asked about kind of competition between China and the US and what that means for cooperation, in space. And I think, you know, obviously a lot of these treaties and agreements happened in the shadow of the Cold War. And so in a time where there's strategic competition like that, you could still get some kind of agreements. I would say, though, there's a difference between the scenarios, and that the strategic competition between the US and China right now is much less like the Cold War. I mean, people use that term Cold War sometimes, but China doesn't want necessarily a kinetic competition with the US. It's more, I think, more of a competition between how we view how the world should operate, at the econ level, at the human rights level. And, we're probably going to have similar disagreements in space about how the governance of space would operate. Will that lead to violent conflict? Maybe not, but it can definitely lead to huge differences in how we think commercial entities should operate in space. And I don't think it's going to be helpful for trying to develop any of these regimes or ways to mitigate the conflict.
Much like Earth, it seems to me that as humans become more and more humans go to the moon, and we become, commercializing the moon, and obviously, access to resources like water and things of that nature. Um, I guess are we going to, what if someone goes up, and I think there's a crater on the moon that, if I'm not mistaken, is they believe has an abundance of water, but there's only one way in, one way out. So if I get there and I go, hey, my company is Space Incorporated, and you can have this water, but you're going to have to pay me for it.
Yeah, I think you'll absolutely see that. People are going to plant flags wherever they land,
Yeah.
and I mean they're only going up there for self-interest, whether that's
Well,
commercial or otherwise.
and so back to what you all were talking about, most of the problems are about, land and resources and things like that. So it seems like this is the same thing.
Well, but the flip side of the coin is if there's private incentives for people to go up there and provide those services, why wouldn't you pay for them?
Mhm.
I mean, that's kind of how it works here. Somebody sees a need, they develop a way to meet that need, and they get rewarded for it. So there is a positive side of that, as long as it remains a commercial competition, and whoever gets there first and does it best wins financially, and it doesn't devolve into some kind of hey, I don't like the flag you're flying there, I'm going to take it from
Yeah.
you.
How do you react to in the beginning of the Ukraine war? If I'm not mistaken, Ukraine was planning an offensive against the Russians, and SpaceX turned off the Starlink to them for some reason, whatever it was. That seemed, when I heard that, I mean, that seemed like a pretty big step. That here you have a company turning off a major space asset on its own decision uh, for something that cost people's lives. Can they all, I mean, I think that's, again, it's not an answer, but is that okay?
A, it's true that did happen. B, it's not unique to space in any way.
Right.
It's always a risk with private control of assets that are publicly, the public depends on. That's why we've seen some of these pushes to nationalization of different things that we think are vital. And C, I mean, being in the startup world, we probably have 30 companies that have, since that and in response to that, and actually in their advertisements, they talk about that, have emerged to
Okay.
provide defense forces with non-Starlink type things, repeaters you can hang from balloons, all sorts of ways that you can mitigate risks to larger communication systems.
I was just going to throw in point D, and I'm not necessarily a defender of SpaceX, but to put myself in their shoes, if they're seen as having contributed to an offensive action, then suddenly they're a belligerent in the conflict, right? And so they potentially put their own interest at risk by choosing sides that are not necessarily even their national interest. or aligned with their nation state. So I can understand from a rational point of view why SpaceX wouldn't want to put itself in that position. But what it also should tell us is, and this is maybe point E, if we're so dependent on those commercial actors for our activities in space, there is a chance they could always, just like any defense contractor, they could decide we're not going to do this anymore. It's not in our interest. It's not worth the price. And we are, heavily dependent on a lot of those actors. So
if you look at the way we deploy sanctions and other things, it's not a private actor monopoly on this sort of behavior, right? The minute a nation has an advantage over another nation wants to change their behavior, they start turning things off. With us, it's access to the SWIFT system, access to international finance, access to, everybody who has an advantage uses it.
A question about, from Warren, about, we've been talking about this, access, the conflict over access to the resources on the moon. And right now, when, we have a lot of, not necessarily state bodies going up, but individual companies going up. I've read an article not too long ago that said, can we own Mars? And I guess you'd say to Mars, and I know about the Space Act Treaty, but can a private company claim that they, like the explorers back in the 1600s, we're here, so we own this?
I fully expect that the minute a company makes an investment to develop resources in space, whether that's less likely on a meteorite, because I think it's harder to get there and take offensive action, but certainly around the moon, if somebody puts money up into developing the water, as you said up there, somebody else is going to invent a security company the minute that there's any hint that there could be a threat to them and provide services to them. And then without the framework of regulation and whatnot that we've been discussing, some kind of accident is very likely to happen.
I mean, we're already seeing it in LEO, right? We're seeing companies that are producing sort of defensive satellites to assist the protection of satellite constellations and so forth. I mean, when we think about it, Elon Musk, when he first introduced Starlink, the contract said, if you are receiving on Earth, then you are abiding by California law. If you're receiving on Mars, you are submitting to the government of Mars, the free government, or whatever he called it, right? And there was all the lawyers, he can't do that. Well, you know what? Guess what he did? He did that. Question is what is our reaction to it?
Right.
And in the short term, it's not like there's potatoes growing on Mars right now, right? When those first humans get to Mars, they're going to need help from Earth. So it'd be kind of dumb to do things that would make Earth mad. So I think, I hope to live to see the day when we see a private territory, some sort of property. And I know I'm just like 300 space lawyers around the world just cringed. But this is what expansion means. And, we're not going to be able to expand and grow unless we bring that commercial aspect. And whether it's payment in some Bitcoin or, trade or something, that's how we're going to get off this earth and start to use the resources. So no, I don't think I think, yes, we are going to have a lot of issues with respect to how close you can get to somebody else on the moon. I mean, there is a first mover advantage. If you are the first one in that lunar South Pole, I saw that come up in the comments. You do have some rights to say, don't get too close to me. This is the area I am occupying right now, under that due regard provision, under the concept of safety zones that is in the Artemis Accords. And what is that going to look like? And this is the space race with China. And again, I agree. China's not looking for a kinetic war, but whichever administration, whichever government gets there first, whichever company, if it's a private company, then that governance structure is going to look very different, right? And it's going to be modeled a certain way. And that first mover is going to have rights and ability to make demands that wouldn't be as strong from the second or third mover.
Yeah, somebody's asked a question, Brennan, which is talked a lot about too, about the space ecosystem having an effect on Earth's ecosystem, space junk, other kinds of things. And there's a lot of other issues that people have brought up that haven't happened, but say could happen. What are your thoughts on that?
So I just came from a working group on dark and quiet skies. So I have a lot of thoughts, but it's already happening, right? Astronomers can't see, or the pictures are getting streaks of what they're trying to see galaxies from far away. I had no idea that we use radio frequencies to find hydrogen around space, and we care about finding hydrogen because that helps us trace how the universe started. And again, do I really care? But the theory of relativity, things that astronomers discovered 100 years ago are foundational to things that we do today. So it's really kind of frightening that we're already changing our night sky, that we're changing the way we can see radio frequencies. And astronomers are really, really terrified. There's a company that wants to bring sunlight during the day. So, for example, your state fair can run 24/7, right? What is that going to do? We were talking about geoengineering. There are a lot of things you can do. And at some point, as much as I am 100% for let's go and get there, let's mine the moon, there is a question of, okay, well, we can, but should we? And I don't think enough people are asking that at this point.
Yeah, there's a space anthropologist that I've worked with who has done some preliminary, and I know there's some data here, but I thought it was kind of interesting. That's looking at basically soil and earth contamination from rocket launches, and those become more prolific, which again is just another one of those side, unexpected things that we have to look at, but also is an effect of in a sense, space on our ecosystem on Earth. And as launches become, much more common as they are now, we're going to see a lot more of that if in fact it's a problem.
Well, and another example, it sort of circles back to what Joe talked about in the very beginning, kind of the human nature and conflict, is you have a number of companies who are trying to develop technologies to clean up orbital debris and are doing so to make space more pristine or cleaner and clean up the environment. And the problem is every single one of those technologies could be used as a weapon and is sort of threatening to any government whose companies don't develop that technology first. And it's sort of like we can clean our environment up, but at the same time we can use those technologies to find another way to fight each other. So that to me is part of the frustration here is we all kind of recognize this is a common good. This is something we should all value. We should cooperate to get farther and farther and explore more and do more. And at the end of the day, we're still self-interested humans in an anarchic state.
We're about out of time. So I may wrap up by asking each of you if you have any final thoughts, Joe.
I think this is a fantastic conversation, and it's been wonderful actually to hear from people and get the questions. And I hope this is just the first in maybe a longer series or more interesting future conversations. So I just want to thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Greg.
Same things. Thank you. I'll use my last comments as my last comments. So appreciate you bringing us in, and this was fun.
It's been great. Michelle, any last thoughts?
Yeah, I just echo the thanks. I will say I'm very, very optimistic. I think,
Good.
I think that we can do this, and we don't necessarily have to be together when we do it, but I think we will ultimately end up together. Thank you.
Scott?
Yeah, thanks, Chris, and fellow panelists. This has been great.
Yeah, no,
I know I painted myself into the curmudgeon corner, but I'm actually also pretty positive. I think 95% of the people out there and 99% of the startups that we meet are trying to do good things for good reasons out there. And ultimately, I think that'll prevail, but there'll be some stumbling blocks getting there.
Yeah. Well, thank all of you again for your time. I know you're all busy. This has really been great. Maybe we're certainly open to having a part two. And so we might think about some of the on things we didn't get to, or we want to elaborate a little bit more. Because as I said, we have a pretty strong global audience on this webcast, so that's clearly an area of interest. Also, for those of you who didn't get to see it all of these are recorded in about a week. They will be on our YouTube page as along with all of our other webcasts, so you can view those at your leisure as well. And again, I want to thank all the sponsors of Humanity in Deep Space and of this project. And again, thank everybody for tuning in and taking part on this really interesting and important conversation. So thank you, and I look forward to seeing you at our next webcast, probably in about a month. Thank you.
Thank you for joining us for Humanity in Deep Space. In his book, Pale Blue Dot, A Vision of the Human Future in Space, Carl Sagan wrote, "Your own life, or your band's, or even your species, may be owed to a restless few, drawn by a craving they can hardly articulate or understand, to undiscovered lands and new worlds." Our continued exploration of space is accompanied by profound questions, responsibilities, and obligations. What is our place and ultimate responsibility to the larger universe? And how do we maintain a sense of humanity as we leave the planet Earth? These questions and more are discussed in our videos, as well as other curated content at www.humanityindeepspace.com or on YouTube by joining Humanity in Deep Space. The music for this episode was written and performed by Danny Grandstaff and is available at dannygrandstaff.bandcamp.com.